Morning everybody. We're continuing with arrays. Today we're going to have a look at a bit of theory, things that we need to know. First of all, we're going to have a look at the scope of variables and constant values. We're going to see that there's different access specifiers that we can use in Visual Basic. Then we're going to see how to use the private class level variables in an SDI application to share array data between different event procedures. In the next topic, I will do a full planning example regarding this. We're also going to have a look at how to use an array declared at module level to share the data in an MDI application where different forms need to share the data. And again in topic 3 I will do a full planning example regarding this. We lastly need to have a look at the logic of filled arrays. Okay, so first of all, access specifiers. In programming we get quite a few different access specifiers. The most important, which would be public and private. There's a whole variety in between depending on the language that we use. Over here the access levels in Visual Basic is displayed. We've got public, protected, friend, private, and private protected. So there's quite a few different ones. For beginners, we're only really interested in public and private. So public means everybody can use this data. Something like my email address. You can share it, use it whenever you want to. If I've got data that other classes needs to use, other classes would be other forms in this application, then I will specify my data via public access specifiers. Take note, I will show you exactly how we're going to do this in an MDI application using modules. Private, on the other hand, is the complete opposite of public. So this is now something like your PIN number of your bank card. You're not going to share it among anybody and everybody. Only you want to use it. So private means that the data can be only used by this specific class. Okay? So public, everybody else. Private, only myself. Okay, really important that you know this difference. Next, I want to have a look at the different scopes available for variables and constant values. And we've got 3 main scopes that you're going to use. Either we're going to have local variables, class level variables and constant values, and module level variables and constant values. I'm going to discuss the 3 different types next. So local variables are nice and easy. This is what you've been using up until now. These are declared inside a procedure or a function. They can only be accessed within that block, so in the procedure or the function. Remember, event procedures are also procedures. I'm going to use the dim reserved word in VB to define the variables. What do I use it for? All variables and constant values that I need to. An example will be something like word, pick Latin and character 1 from a button event procedure that I did as an example previously. So anything defined in a function or procedure, using them. These are local variables, and they would only be accessible, available, up until the end. So up until, for this sub procedure, up until I get end sub. If I define that in a function, these variables would only be accessible, usable, up until end function. Next, we've got class level variables. I'm normally going to use them when I've got a single document interface, so one screen only, but different event procedures must share the data. So I need to use the same data between two different buttons or different menu options, etc. I will define class level constant values and variables inside a class. The class level data can only be accessed within the class, or must only be accessed within the class. All functions and procedures that's declared in the class can use them, can access them. We're going to use the private reserved word to define them, because only this class must use them. Important to note, when will I use them? Only when different event procedures in the same class must share the same data. Real important. Be very careful. Don't go and define all your variables at class level just because it's easy. It's real bad practice. We're only going to use class level variables when it's really necessary. So when I need to share data. An example, we're going to see that from example 1. Topic 1, topic 2 actually, where I define my array for pets and the constant value to specify how many pets I want. They are defined at class level, so just after public class, name of the form, and I define them with private. Any function or procedure coded in this class now, in form pets, can use the array and max if we want to, without sending it as parameters. So there is a benefit to us. I don't need to use parameters. But as I said, we're not just going to define all the variables there. That's bad practice and wrong. So we will just use the data that's got to be shared. So only the things that's got to be shared as class level variables. The last scope that we're going to have a look at would be modules. So we don't find modules in all the programming languages. In VB.NET, a module is a thing that's going to share data. It's a container, so it's a storage thing in VB.NET. And it's going to use to store variables and constant values in an MDI application where I share data between different forms. Okay? Very important. MDI applications where I need to share data between different forms. A module will then be declared in a project and visible, all the data declared in the module will be visible to the entire project. So in VB.NET, as I said before, we're going to use modules for MDI applications where I need to share data, and for now it would be array data between different forms. Module level data will only be accessed within my project. We will use the public reserved word to define the data. This data must be usable or accessible by all the different forms in the project. So I need to define the array and the variables that I want to use as public variables. If I define them as private, then they can only be used in this module. This is not what I want. Public, because all the other forms must be able to use my data. When will I use it? Only when different forms in the same project must access the same data. Again, be careful. We're not just going to define all the variables now at module level. That's real wrong, bad practice. We're only going to use module level variables and constants when it's really necessary. So when I need to share the same data between different forms. An example that you're going to find in topic 3 would be the amounts array to store different expense amounts. And I'm going to have one form that add amounts and another form that's going to display the data that I've got currently stored. In the first section of the topic then, I discussed the scope of variables and the different access specifiers. Now we're going to have a look at filled arrays. So at first year level, we're going to store data in arrays in two ways. Either all at once, and this we've been doing up until now, or we're going to store one value at a time until the array is full or until there's no more space in the array or no more data. This is called a partially filled array. We've already discussed and saw many examples how we fill the array all at once. We're always going to use a counter-controlled loop to add the data. This loop will go from subscript 0 up until length of the array -1, and I need to use something like an input box because I'm using a loop to get all my data. So input box, get the data, save it in the array element. Partially filled arrays, on the other hand, will work as follows. I am going to declare an array, but I'm also going to declare an array counter. And let's call it AR count for now. Array counter. So this array counter will tell me how many items are stored in the array. Now, it would obviously start at 0 because right at the start no data would be saved. Take note, when I add data, I would normally use one screen now, one form to add the data that's called from a menu, and this would add one item at a time. So we can now get the data from a text box. The user will enter one value and click on a button to save the data. First thing that we need to do is to check if the array still has space to store my data. If the array is filled, we're going to display an error and we're not going to do any further processing because we can't add the data. If there is still space in the array, I'm going to add the next data element to the next available position at that AR count position, and then I will increment my array counter by 1 to show that one more element was saved. So a code example in VB would look like this in the button event procedure now. Test if my array has got space. Array counter tells me how much data or how many items I've got currently stored. Array name.length, this would tell me the maximum size, the maximum number of elements to be saved. We can also use max if you want to. Array name.length, marginally better. I will then get the data from the text box, and this just stores names, so I can immediately save it. I will save it at position array counter, and then I will increment the array counter by 1. If there's no space in the array, I will simply display an error message. And this will stop my program. All my loops must traverse the array now from index 0 to array counter -1. So I'm not going to go length -1 anymore, because I don't know how, well, array counter tells me how many items I'm saving currently in the array. So I can't use the enhanced for loop now. This loop traverses the entire array. I want to only traverse a partial section of the array, the section that's filled with data. So my code would look as follows. And now we need to pay close attention. Let's do this. The for loop will start at 0 and will continue up to array counter -1. Array counter tells me how many elements. My subscript would always be one less. A for loop needs a counter variable, so we're just going to use count. And in this example, we just take every one of the elements stored in the array. Count will first have the value 0, then that would be replaced by 1, and then it would be replaced by 2, etc. up until array count -1. So, don't get confused. The for loop needs a counter. Whenever I use the array in the loop, it would be with the for loop counter. My for loop must go from 0 to array count -1 if I'm going from the first to the last element stored. Okay, so need to remember a little bit where to use array counter. Okay, let's now go have a look at an example of a partially filled array. Assume we've got an array that can store 3 names, or that must store 3 names. I am going to do the following. In a module, I'm first of all going to define a constant value. Maximum is the easiest, and this will tell me how many elements to store in the array. Then I'm going to specify my array, and I want to save names, so the type would be string. How many elements? Maximum -1. And thereafter I need my array counter, and we're just specifying that it starts at 0. This is the default value as well. Why use a maximum constant? Oh, it's rather easy. If my code needs to update now, let's say for testing purposes I only wanted to store 3 elements. I want to test that my program works fine, so if I added a 4th element, the code must give an error. I use a very low number now for maximum. But once I confirmed that the code works, I can change this. If I now want to say 3,000 names, I simply change maximum to that, and the rest of the code is updated as well. Okay, so a constant value for the number of elements is real nice to use. Right at the start, we start at a lowish value. After we confirm that all the code works perfectly fine, we can update maximum to whatever value we required. So 500 if I need to store 500 names. I need to use subscript max -1 for the highest subscript, because my subscripts, if I want to store 500 elements, must go from 0 to 499. But let's just change this to 3 back for my example. If I define those variables, then the data would look as follows in the memory. I've got an array called array names that's got 3 elements, and array counter that starts at 0. We can ignore maximum for now for the purpose of this program. Let's say as step 1, the button event procedure was selected by the user to add one name. And let's assume Ben was typed into the text box by the user. So if my code now executes, code shown before, then it will take Ben from the text box, array count is 0. So that means Ben will be saved in array count position. Thereafter, array count is incremented by 1. 0 plus 1 gives me 1. So now after this code executes, my array stores 1 element of data, Ben, and my array counter says one thing is stored. If somebody go click on the button again to add one more name, and let's say Sue is typed in to the text box by the user, then this code will execute again. So currently array count would be, array count would be 1. So test, is 1 less than 3? Yes, it is. Get the name Sue, save the name at position 1 in the array. So that means Sue would be added over here. Next, I add 1 to array counter to say one more element of data is saved. Let's say step 3, the user now selected an option to display all the names currently stored. I will have a loop that goes from 0 to array count minus 1. So a loop that goes from 0 to 1. I've got data stored at position 0 and position 1. So, right at the start, the very first time this loop executes, count will have the position 0, and that means Ben will be displayed. Next, count will increment the counter, it will be 1, and that means next Sue would be displayed in the lists box. Next count increments counter to 2, and thus the array will stop. So my loop will explain or display exactly the data currently stored in the list box. Let's say as the last step, the user again wants to add one name. He typed Joe into the text box. So this code, currently array count, stores 2. So if I use array count position, my next element in the array will get the next data. So whatever was typed into the text box, go save it in the array and add 1 to array count. And now we can see the array is filled. So if the user, as a next step, typed in Mary and then again click on the add button, the following is going to happen. We're going to test array count. Current value is 3. Is that less than the length of the array? Is 3 less than 3? And we get the answer no. So that means this error message would be displayed to the user and the data stays as it is. Data is added. Well, the last data can't be added because there's no space in the array. Okay, so really important to test if there's space. If there's space, we just display an error message. After the end if, we will have the end of the sub-procedure, and this means no more processing will take place. Okay, in topic 2 and 3, we're going to do examples, showing exactly the theory that I've discussed now. Thank you.